Welcome to October's Tech of the Month. This month we brought you a bike special because there are finally some new bikes actually being launched for us to talk about. We also have the opportunity for one lucky viewer to win a TaxFlux 2 Smart Trainer, so stay tuned for that. Without further ado, Simon, you have a bike that has been actually raced quite openly on the World Tour stage for some time. We can finally show you all the tech details.
This is the new Cervelo R5 and it's actually just launched to the public, but Primoz Roglic first rode it in Flèche back in April, and then the whole of the Jumbo-Visma team rode it from the Tour de France onwards. But it's only now that we've just been able to get our hands on it and have a look at it close up.
So it has actually already won a Grand Tour. I mean, admittedly not independently, but it has been on the top step.
It has. It was one of the bikes. The S5 is the other one that Jumbo-Visma have been riding, but the R5 is the one that Primoz Roglic held up above his head when he won the Vuelta this year for the third time.
And it looks quite a lot like the previous R5. There are some quite subtle changes. Tell us about the most important ones.
Yeah, it looks very much like the old R5, but the feedback that Cervelo had been given from the pro teams who were riding for 3 weeks in the Grand Tours on it was that it was a little bit too harsh, especially at the front end. And so what they've done is they've actually reduced the stiffness, which is pretty unusual, pretty rare thing to hear, that a bike is actually less stiff than the previous model, but that's exactly what they've done. So the front end has got a lot more compliance, and the rear end also is more comfortable. So the last R5, Cervelo concentrated on making that a lot stiffer, and they increased the size of the down tube into this thing that they called Squoval Max. So it was like an enormous tube, a square and an oval combined. This time the size is actually reduced. So it's called Squoval. It's not Squoval Max anymore, it's just Squoval now.
Not Squoval Min.
Squoval Medium.
Yes.
And by doing that, that means that it can just flex a little bit more. Cervelo actually, they told me that they have been using Tom Dumoulin as their test pilot, their crash test dummy, because he's actually followed them from Sunweb over to Jumbo-Visma. So he's actually been involved in the development of the bike all the way through. He was one of the ones who apparently was very vocal about it being a bit too harsh at the front. So once they'd made these changes to it, once they'd redesigned the down tube and incorporated a different carbon layup, they gave it to him to test, and apparently he was really happy with it. He said he could climb just as efficiently, and it was what he'd been looking for.
I mean, it's interesting because we've seen for decades brands were constantly looking for stiffer frames. We wanted everything to be stiffer because they were at the time sometimes a bit noodly. Now we've almost got to the point that we've gone too far and brands are kind of backstepping on that. I mean, has it lost any stiffness, or are they claiming it's now more comfortable but also stiffer? The
stiffness is obviously going to be maintained, but the compliance is going to be increased. So this new front end and the new down tube does that. Also the fork has been redesigned, it's a slightly different shape. You can see that it's slightly straighter than before, it's not quite as tapered. The fork has the same lateral stiffness, but longitudinally it's more compliant, so you've got a little bit more comfort at the front there.
So we have changed the carbon layup and the slightly smaller down tube. I imagine that it's a little bit lighter from the previous model as well?
Yeah, it's actually quite a bit lighter. Cervelo is saying it's 130 grams lighter, so now the frame weight is 703 grams in a size 56. And that's actually painted, and that's actually this paint, this actual frame, which is a 56, Cervelo are claiming weighs 703 grams. By making it lighter and more compliant, the aerodynamics actually slightly suffered, and so Cervelo have had to work on other areas of the bike to make it a little bit more aerodynamic, which is what they're claiming. The integrated front end with the cables now running down inside the head tube is one way that they've done that. Another is that they've just redesigned the fork crown, and it now has what they're calling a little chin, here. This chin leads the airflow down more smoothly into the down tube. At the rear end, Cervelo have redesigned the seat clamp. So before there was a kind of a little rubber cover over here. Now it's completely been taken inboard so that you've got a flat area here. So that's another little trick that makes it a little bit faster. They have said that they've had it in the wind tunnel and it's a little bit faster than the old R5, but not by much. We don't have any numbers for that yet, but the point is that it's a little bit faster, a little bit more aerodynamic.
So when we first had the bike in, I noticed when you actually put some pressure on the saddle, you do see the seat post really does flex back and forward. Now we have seen another high profile bike where the seat post did flex back and forward. And that was the Canyon Air Road, and we do know that that was then followed by some quite significant issues with wear to that seat post. Canyon did say that it was only aesthetic, not structural, but they did also replace an awful lot of customers' seat posts. So has Cervelo gone down exactly the same route?
It's hard to know really, because the Canyon was clamped a lot lower down inside the seat tube, and I think that's where the problem really started. So the bolt is directly underneath this cover here, which means that that's where the wedge is. So probably what we're seeing is a lot of flex because of the actual carbon that the seat post is made of, and so I don't see that there's going to be a problem with it damaging the top of the seat tube or the seat stay wishbone.
That is good to hear, but it's certainly something we'll be keeping a really close eye on in testing, right?
Yeah.
So have they done anything special with the geometry this time?
They haven't actually. They've done nothing at all with the geometry. They've left it exactly as it is. There are 6 sizes from 48 to 61. And Cervelo have realised that this is a geometry that works really well. The last R5 handled really nicely, and so they're not going to mess with it. The only little difference they've made is to add 0.5 millimetre onto the fork trail, and that's because this bike has clearance for bigger tyres. It can now take 34 millimetre tyres. The last one was 28, so there's quite a lot more clearance there.
So the wheels, they're badged up as reserve?
Yeah, these are the new reserve road bike wheels, which all the 4 builds are going to come with. And they have differential rim profiles, which is what we're seeing more and more of from Envy and Parkour as well. The front is fatter and the rear is sort of more V-shaped.
We are actually seeing more bike brands coming out with their own wheel brands, and at the same time we are also seeing smaller brands coming out with very competitive spec sheets at much cheaper prices than the big brands. I think it is just now cheaper to create a pretty good wheel set.
It does seem like that, it does, and I'm sure that these are their own design, they're not open mold wheels, and it makes sense probably from a cost point of view to have your own in-house components on a bike.
I mean, that seat post is very obviously proprietary, so you are very much at Cervelo's mercy of them continuing to make that seat post if you buy this frame. What about the bar and stem?
Yeah, the bar and stem are Cervelo's own components again, and they have proprietary spacers, although at least they have spacers, and they're split as well so that you can adjust the stack height.
So this being the R5, and Cervelo have the R3, which is the more entry-level version of its climbing bike. This being the R5, it'll be the top-end version. I mean, you've got Force. Is that pretty much the entry level to this R5 range? Yeah,
it is. There are 4 builds altogether. So you've got the top 2 Shimano and the top 2 SRAM, which means you've got Dura-Ace, the new Dura-Ace Di2 and the Ultegra Di2, and SRAM Red and SRAM Force. It's actually worth pointing out that this is an electronic-only bike. You can't run a mechanical group set on it, and it's disc-only as well. There's no rim brake version.
And I noticed you've got a power meter here. Do you also get a power meter on the Shimano builds?
You don't. You just get power meters on the SRAM builds,
That's
which is quite interesting. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Okay, so the price, $12,000 is the price for the Dura-Ace Di2 and the SRAM Red version. So they're the same price, but you get the Red power meter, but you don't get the Dura-Ace power meter.
Interesting.
So we haven't had any quoted weights for the various builds, but Cervelo told me that this one with Force actually weighs 7.3 kilos, which is pretty good. That's the new Cervelo R5, which is a bit lighter than before. It's a bit more comfortable than before. It's also a bit more aerodynamic than before. It has the same geometry. It's for electronic group set and disc brake only. And it comes in 4 builds. And this SRAM Force equipped build comes in at £8,599.
The bike that I'm going to talk about this month is the Trek Checkpoint. The Checkpoint is Trek's gravel platform. It's new out, came out on the 30th of September, and it will hopefully end what has been quite a serious drought for Trek as a result of the supply and demand issues that we've seen across the cycling industry. I think it's fair to say that Trek have been quite significantly hit. We haven't seen a lot of stock, so it's really great to see them coming out with a new bike. The Checkpoint has been around for a while. At the moment, they've got the SL and the ALR version. They will now have an SLR, which is a much more racy bike, the SL, which is the bikepacking style bike, and then continue to have the ALR, which is more of a utility machine.
Typically when we have a top-level carbon version, it can generally just be the layup. Are there any other differences like to the geometry and other aspects of the frame with this top-level one?
So they have firstly used a different carbon. So it's OCLV 700 on the SLR versus 500 on the SL. So we do have that differentiation. What is more interesting, I would wager, is the placement of the ISO speed on the SL versus the SLR. On the SL, it's in the traditional position on the junction between the seat tube and the seat stays, and that's where we've typically seen the ISO speed in the past. It works by providing just that little bit of flex in the seat tube. Now, the difference here is that on the SLR, they've mounted the ISO speed actually in the top tube. You still get flex of the seat tube, but what they've done is taken it away from any sort of structural element of the frame. And it also means that it's no longer impacted by the size of the frame. So Trek said on the smaller frames, you were not getting as much flex in the traditional position. However, here you'll get a much more consistent experience. And the reason they haven't added it to the SL is that they wanted to have dropper post compatibility.
What about the front end? Does it have an ISO speed at the front?
No, and Trek gave some pretty interesting answers on that. Asked specifically whether there was any ISO speed compliance at the front end. They said, at some point, the volume of the tyre becomes a dominant part of the compliance experience for the bike, especially for front ISO speed. And that additional compliance is very subtle. So what they're saying there is that by the time you've added a really plush tyre, like a 40 or a 45, you're not really going to actually notice any compliance that you're getting from the ISO speed. Whereas at the rear, you do get around a centimetre of travel. You do get more because your body weight is there. It's going to flex more. And they felt that that was noticeable and was worth adding, but not really at the front. Whereas on a road bike, you've got 25, 28 mil tyres. You aren't getting quite so much compliance from those. There were a few things that they said that just people wouldn't use or wouldn't notice that they had chosen not to add. One of those quite noticeably was they've got rid of the stranglehold dropouts that they had at the rear of the bike. And the idea of that was that it would allow people to change the geometry and they could also adjust, get greater tyre clearance if they wanted it. Trek said they found that in reality, people weren't using it. And it both added complication, added weight, added expense to the cost of the bike. And so they decided just to drop it.
So have I done anything different with the geometry this time?
A lot has stayed the same, so the stack and reach, the stack and effective reach are the same. However, Trek has done exactly what everybody else seems to have done this year in adopting what we're calling progressive geometry. And it's very much something that's come over from the mountain bike side. It's a term that's been widely used by our brother titles, MBR. Effectively just means that your front center is increased. So they've added 2 centimeters to the front center and then they've reduced the stem and handlebar reach. So the rider's effective reach is the same, but you're getting it in the top tube as opposed to having a longer stem.
So is it meant to be used for anything different? It's not meant to be like a gravel race bike or anything like that?
Well, the SLR is. Right. So the SLR, they're calling the race bike. The geometry is still the same, but you've got that top tube ISO speed instead of having it in the traditional position between the seat stays and the seat tube. You haven't got the dropper post and you also don't have as many mounts. So the SLR doesn't have rack mounts, which the SL does. They both do have hidden storage. Which is a nice thing to have. Trek did point out that not a good place to put gummy bears, apparently, if it's hot, which is a very valid point, probably not a very smart place to put those. Speaking of integration, I suppose, that's a nice segue onto the cables. The cables are now integrated on both the SLR and the SL models. Which is something that we've talked about a lot in the office. We're not always huge, or some of us aren't always huge fans. The reason that Trek's given is that it's neater when you're mounting bags, so which is very, very valid. So when you're mounting a bar bag, cables really can get in the way. And to be fair to Trek, the system looks really good. So it's very similar to what they've got on the Madone and the Emonda. And you have the cables actually come in through a little space that sits underneath the spaces below the stem. And you still have pretty round looking spaces and a traditional 31.8 bar and stem. So you're not tied to having to use that bar and stem. And it does look pretty neat. So although I'm not always the biggest fan of integrated cables, in this case, it looks like they've done quite a good job.
So does the SLR come with suspension, or do any of them come with suspension?
So none of them come with suspension. So across the SL range, some forks they say are acceptable, whereas they said for structural reasons, the SLR is not compatible with any suspension forks. And they said that there are a lot of new gravel forks coming out, and we had the SRAM Explore quite recently, which is probably the most high profile version, but there's plenty others on the market as well. And it is something that gravel riders it would seem, starting to want. I know there are a few other brands that are intending to launch gravel bikes this year that will come with suspension. So it seems like Trek might be a tiny bit behind in this case. They did say that whilst we do see the benefit of suspension, the vast majority of riders are preferring the simplicity of a rigid fork on a gravel bike. And that is probably true, but I think it's something that we will start to see changing over the next couple of years. I guess it depends whether or not the consumer adopts it. So it sort of, remains to be seen. And just another kind of point of interest on this frame is that Trek is also bringing out via its accessory brand Bontrager a range of size-specific frame bags, which is really nice to see. They've got 6 different sizes that fit with specific frames, and they do mount very, very neatly. So you actually have some really nice, like the top tube mounts are very neat, very well hidden as well. So there you have it, the Trek Checkpoint SLR, SL and ALR. Across the range, you've got wider tyre clearance, progressive geometry, which we're seeing across an awful lot of gravel bikes. And then on that SLR, you have this new top tube ISO speed, which is very much Trek's party trick. We mentioned at the start of this video that we have an exciting prize that you can win this month. So Simon, do you want to go and collect the prize?
It's the wrong way around.
There is a chance to win the Tacx Flux 2 Smart Trainer. It is a direct drive smart trainer. It will handle up to 2000 watts, which is certainly twice more than I can put out, and will replicate climbs up to 16%, which you'll definitely feel. Accuracy is a claimed 2.5%. To enter to win, click the link in the video description and follow the information there. We'll announce the winner 3 weeks after this video goes live. Good luck!
So next we have the new Merida Scultura. This is the 5th iteration, and the improvements have all been quite iterative, but there's really no prizes for guessing what's changed with this bike. It's more aerodynamic, it's claimed to be lighter, and it's also claimed to be a little bit stiffer than the previous one.
Bingo!
Yeah, bingo, exactly.
So there are some actual numbers about how much stiffer, how much lighter. What's the frame weight?
Yeah, so the frame weight, it's not going to blow you away. In size medium, it's 822 grams, and so with a specialized AFOS, with a Canyon Ultimate, this can be below 700 grams. So it's not mind-blowingly light, but it is claimed to be 38 grams lighter than the previous version. So there's been a little bit of an improvement in that department. So it's not just a percentage that we've been given. Normally we hear that a bike is 10%, 16% more compliant, less stiff or stiffer than the previous version. But with the Merida, we've actually been given some numbers on just how compliant the bike is. So the vertical stiffness from the bottom bracket to the saddle has been reduced from 111 newtons per millimeter of deflection to now just 80. And which is a fairly significant change in percentage terms, and which you should be able to feel when riding along.
So we've got more compliance at the rear end. Elsewhere, is there a stiffness increase? It's usually a pretty common claim.
Exactly, and so at the bottom bracket, they've claimed to just keep the stiffness at the same amount, whereas at the fork, they've chosen to increase the stiffness a little bit, up by 12.8%, now to 53 newtons per millimeter of deflection.
You've also got some fairly wide tyres on there by the looks of it. What is the max tyre clearance as well?
Yeah, exactly. So these are the Continentals in 28s, and they are looking a bit plumper than 28 millimeters on these particular rims. The clearance is claimed to be up to 30 millimeters, but to be fair, I think you could go wider
like
still.
There's
back clearance and even around the front mech, and so the claimed clearance is 30 millimeters, but there seems to be plenty of room.
So do they have any aero claims for it? Is it more aerodynamic than the previous model?
Yeah, they're claiming that as well. And so at 45 kilometers an hour, the claim is that this bike is 10 watts faster or 10 watts more efficient than the previous Merida Scultura.
And where is most of that coming from? I can see the cables are internal, so is that going to be part of it?
The seat stays have also been dropped, so hitting those two tick boxes as well. Unfortunately, we weren't given the details on exactly which wind tunnel was used and the testing protocol that was used. And so we're going to have to take these numbers largely on faith.
As we don't have a wind tunnel ourselves.
So things that have kind of remained the same with the Sculptura is the geometry, and that is the same race geometry as Merida uses on its reactor aero bikes. And we also have the disc coolers that are something quite unique to Merida, which are supposed to work as a heat sink and help reduce heat buildup from the disc rotors under braking.
I can't help but sort of have my eye drawn to the rear mech camera as well. It looks an awful lot like the design that we have on a lot of Scott bikes. And we have had a few of those arrive bent. So those haven't been great. But this looks like a very similar design, but much more sturdy.
Yeah, it does feel really, really quite solid. I mean, almost to the point that will it work as the sacrificial element that it's supposed to and brake instead of the rear derailleur. So, but yeah, it does feel nice and sturdy. And it isn't something that you're going to I think, knock out of alignment just when packing it up or wheeling it around, which is, good to see.
I mean, this is in the team colours and it's wearing Dura-Ace, so it's clearly going to be the top of the line model. Have we got any other options in the market at the moment?
Right now, it's just this model in this spec, but I'm sure that the frame's going to be trickling down through the range and also with different builds for more affordable price points. So it's £7,750, which for a bike that's World Tour level with a full Dura-Ace build, that's really quite reasonable. I mean, normally we're expecting these bikes these days to be what, £12,000, £13,000?
Yeah, that is actually cheap.
It does come in a lot more reasonably than the really big three. I think Merida doesn't really sit within those very top tier brands, yet we do know that their factories do make bikes for a lot of said really top tier brands. So you're actually getting a pretty good deal there.
Exactly, like bikes themselves are exceptional quality. There's maybe not that kind of brand cachet quite so much, but then at the end of the day, it's the bike that you want to pay for and not the name that's printed on the side of a bike. And so I think that it's a really, really good deal. So that's the new Merida Scultura. It's a little bit more aero, a little bit lighter, a little bit more compliant than the previous version, and it's sporting the new Dura-Ace. So quite an interesting bike and all.
Very nice.
I hope that you enjoyed this month's bike special edition of Tech of the Month.
Please let us know what you thought of the bikes down in the comments.
And if you want to see more of our videos, then click subscribe.